So I want to thank everybody for coming today and for picking this session and allowing me to stand up here and talk to you for 45 minutes or so about hacking, about the anatomy of a hack. Just a little bit about myself. My name is Eric Anderson. I work for BMC Software. And this is not going to be a sales pitch by any means. In fact, I only have one slide that even talks about BMC at the very end. And my goal here is education, right? I want to provide some education for you. I'm going to talk a lot about some of the tactics, some of the motivations and strategies. But again, a little bit about myself. I've been in the IT industry for almost 25 years now, all the way from sitting on operations teams working on patching solutions, vulnerabilities, application development, architecture, and currently I'm the CTO for the SecOps business unit inside BMC. So again, today we're going to talk a little bit about, well, a lot of it actually, about hacking, about what actually occurs during a hack, right? And as I go through these concepts, please understand that with something like this, there really is no absolute statements that you can make. So you'll hear me say in a lot of cases, I'll say things like, in most cases, on average, you can't make any definite terms that say this is exactly what happens every single time, because we know that would be false. So I'll talk a lot about, first of all, motivations, right? What's motivating them? And that's only one slide, because I think for the most part, everybody understands what's probably motivating them. I'll spend a little bit of time about how they get in. There's a couple of different attack vectors that are very, very common. So we'll talk through those. We'll talk about the most common cases. Again, it's not exhaustive that says this is how everything happens. Once inside your network, what's happening, right? What's happening inside your network? How long are they in there? What are they doing? And how can you detect some of it? And then finally, in fact, we'll spend probably about half the time here talking about what you can do about it. There's some tactics and strategies above and beyond what you might have heard in the keynote and everything else about how you can prevent some of this from happening in the first place, how you can detect it, and generally speaking, what you can do about it. So to get started, let's look at goals and motivations. Now, generally speaking, and again, like I said, generally speaking, there's about 3 different classifications of hackers that are out there. You've got your state-sponsored hackers. You've got your organized crime and your individuals. They all have slightly different motivations and slightly different fingerprints and footprints around what's happening inside. So state-sponsored, generally very, very highly organized, right? These are places like Russia, North Korea, places like that. Zero-day hoarding is a very, very important concept for them. And you heard about some of that earlier on today, where there may be 0 days for years and years and years before they're actually come out and made available to the public. In most cases, the state-sponsored hackers are the ones that are hoarding those 0 days. There's no financial gain for them, and of course, they want to hold on to as much as possible. False flag footprints we'll talk about, but generally speaking, state-sponsored, very, very, very targeted, right? I mean, they're going after some very specific things. Unless, and I've given this talk a couple of times, unless you're a sensitive government target, which some of you may actually be, generally you're not too worried about state-sponsored attackers, because there's only a couple of states that you really should be worried about there. When you compare it to the other 2 classifications, I mean, they're looking for espionage, state secrets, reconnaissance, they're looking to damage infrastructure. You can kind of understand their motivation. Most of the time, they're dealing with reconnaissance. They're trying to figure it out. They're trying to figure out what they might be able to exploit later on, right, should they need to. And then the second classification is organized crime. And again, we're not talking about the mafia here. We're talking about collectives. We're talking about groups that work together. And if you've got maybe, I don't know, 10 highly organized states that are engaging in espionage type activities, you've probably got on the order of 100 to 200 groups, highly organized groups that are out there. Their motivation is very different, right? A lot of cases they're into selling services, right? They're very organized as well. A lot of the innovation comes out of these groups also. Large-scale attacks, denial of service attacks, A lot of these are coming from the highly organized groups. Now, if they're selling services, if there's a denial of service attack going on, it may not be that this organized unit is really interested in affecting that company. Somebody may have paid them to do it. They're selling services, right? But generally speaking, when they're actually targeting a group, they're looking for corporate secrets. They're looking for any kind of marketable data. In most cases, right, the organized groups, they're looking for some way to market and sell this data, right? Their motivation is money. In some cases, it's more activism, hacktivism, and social change. But for the most part, money's their top objective. And again, you may have, just throwing out some average numbers here, you may have 10 of these. You may have 200 of these worldwide versus 1 million of these. So you can start to see where your focus may want to be. Now, if you look at the individuals, and you've got millions of these guys, anywhere from the 13-year-old kid running around in a basement, you know, all the way on up. There's millions of these people out here that are using things like toolkits, phishing examples, which we'll talk about a little bit later. They're looking for easy opportunities, right? You know, they're not necessarily the type of people, again, we're talking in general terms. There's obviously going to be some individuals that are highly motivated and highly targeted to attack a particular group or a particular organization, but generally speaking, they're looking for easy opportunities, right? What can I very easily hack into and try to extract data? And when you talk to these people, I've talked to a lot of these people over the years, a lot of conferences like DEF CON and Black Hat. I ask them all the time, why do you do it? You know, I'm a cybersecurity professional, right? You're on the other side of this. Why do you do it? The number one answer that I get is, just for the fun. What they call is the lulz. Just for the lulz. It's the fun. I do it because I can, right? In some cases, they're looking for what they call street cred because they want to be able to prove to their buddies that they can do something, or they're looking to get into one of these organized groups, and in order to get in, you have to prove yourself. In some cases, again, they're looking to expose some corruption. I do hear on occasion, well, it's for the money, I'm trying to find some marketable data or things like that. But it surprises me how often these first three actually come up, right? It's really because I can, right? And that should scare you because there seems to be very little concern for their own safety, right? I'm not doing it for any particular reason other than I'm bored. I'm bored, I'm sitting at home, right? I figured I'm going to go ahead and try. Let me try to hack into this group. Let me try to hack into this company. That should scare you because there's very little concern over getting caught if they do it the right way. So goals and motivations. Again, I promised only one slide on this because you know, I think for the most part, if you're in the cybersecurity industry, you probably understand a lot of this to begin with. So let's look at the next slide. We're going to talk a lot about threat vectors. A threat vector is basically the path or the means by which a hacker can make their way into your network. And there's three really big threat vectors that we'll talk about. And we'll talk about them one by one. The first one, probably the most obvious one, is of course the internet. Anything that's internet facing is going to be targeted. There's no doubt about it. And in fact, when you publish a new IP address on the internet, right, what's the first thing that you think of? If we're going to try to protect ourselves from the outside world, you may have seen the same analogy on the keynote earlier on today. Well, we generally think about, well, I'm going to put up a boundary. I'm going to put up a wall, a firewall, around my whole network. All right? And this is the most common answer that I get when I ask companies or people to envision something that represents their firewall or their boundary. They say, well, it's like a castle wall, right? I'm protecting the outside world. I'm protecting the inside from the big bad outside world. And it's like a castle wall. Well, in the networking world, nothing is ever this solid, right? And in reality, our walls look a lot more like this, right? There's ports open all over the place. Rarely do you have any firewall that has 0 ports open from the outside world. Now, maybe some exist, but if you look at a vast majority of them, there are ports all over the place. So what happens? You know, if we were dealing with a medieval-style attack, you'd see the army coming from a mile away. You heard about it earlier. You'd see arrows flying all over the place, and you'd be able to mount your defenses. Well, that's not what happens. In reality, if this was a medieval defense, in the hacking world, people are just walking up to this wall and they're slowly looking into one of these little holes to see what's on the other side. And they don't see something they like and they kind of meander over and look at the next hole. How does this look? No, nothing that I like in there either. They're peeking through the firewall. They're doing a port scan. They're looking at all your ports and trying to see what's on the other side of that port, right? Because you can see through your firewall by looking through those holes in the wall. You're looking through the ports. And eventually you may look through one and go, oh, hold on a minute. I see something on the other side that looks vulnerable to me, right? Maybe it's an Apache server. Maybe it's a whatever, right? And of course, the next thing they do is start to figure out how can I squeeze through that hole to get inside that protected area and start wreaking havoc. So go back to my statement earlier. From the time that we put up a new IP address that's internet facing, on average, 0.025 seconds is how long it takes before something starts looking in those holes. Think about that for a second. A quarter of a second after you put an IP address on the internet, you're already getting scanned. Now, there's tons of automated scanners running around on the web. They pick random IP addresses, and they take the most common, say, 20 or 30 ports, and they look at your IP address and say, hey, is anything open, right? And if they don't find anything, they move on. If they don't find anything there, they move on. And they run through thousands and thousands and thousands of these a second. And it's, for the most part, it's random. So you put an IP address out there, within a quarter of a second, you're dealing with a port scan on your environment. Ask anybody that's looked at firewall logs from the outside world, and you're going to see thousands and thousands and thousands of scans against your ports. Right? So within a quarter of a second, a port scan happens. Well, once they find something that seems to be interesting to them, they look through those holes, and I'm going to use the same example, they find an Apache server on the other side. Well, the next step is going to be discovery, right? So they're trying to figure out what actually is on the other side. Is there a database, which is not good practice? Maybe it's there, maybe it's not. Right? Is it a web server? What's on the other side that I might be able to take advantage of? This is discovery. Right? They're trying to look through those little holes and discover what's on the other side. Well, the next step comes vulnerabilities. Once I know that that is an Apache server XYZ version, it's very easy to go off and hit one of 15 different sites and say, well, okay, what kind of vulnerabilities exist for that particular version of that particular piece of software? Right? And I haven't seen software yet that is completely devoid of vulnerabilities. Anybody that follows the market and understands our vulnerabilities are skyrocketing across the industry. So next step then, right, we run a port scan, we discover what's behind the holes, we look at vulnerabilities. The next step is exploits and toolkits. Well, I know there's a vulnerability out there. There's probably 7 or 8 of them, at least. Are there any public exploits? Are there any toolkits that I can just download and worm my way through that hole and deploy some kind of payload on that particular target system? Because in most cases, their goal is not that system. They're just using that as the vector to make their way into the network and then move laterally from there. And we heard about some of that earlier on in the keynote as well. After they run an exploit or find an exploit or a toolkit, that's when they execute their hack. Their hack is basically using that exploit along with a payload that they may have designed themselves, a bit of code that has to be executed on that target system. Anytime you can successfully execute code on a target system, game over. You're done. Because it doesn't matter what. It could be keylogger that they put out there. It could be a virus. It could be a backdoor. It could be anything. Right? Once you get to this point, exploits and hacks, it's over. They've made their way through that little bitty hole in your outer castle wall, and they're running amok inside the castle. The next threat vector, most common threat vector, is compromised websites. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this because I think we all understand and know what compromised websites are. It's basically just a website that is either intentionally built for malicious software, or more likely, somebody has previously hacked and deployed malicious code out there. So what that malicious code is looking for is every time somebody hits that with a browser, if that browser has a certain vulnerability. Go back to the previous statement, right? If it has a certain vulnerability because it's an older browser version, or something it hasn't been patched yet or fixed, in that case, code can be downloaded directly from that compromised website. And again, virus, worms, ransomware, whatever, doesn't really matter. The moment we can download code on that system, our house is on fire and we've let somebody in the front door. Okay? Internet being by and far the most common threat vector, it's not the most successful, right? Because you can tell by what I said earlier, you're getting attacked thousands and thousands and thousands of times a day. Compromised websites, second most common threat vector. The most successful threat vector, though, is not the most common. The most successful is phishing. And we're going to talk a little bit between differences between phishing and spear phishing. And if you think about the actual common terms, phishing, I drop a hook in the water, millions of fish swim by, nobody bites it. Something bites, I pull it up and see what it is. It may or may not be what I was looking for. Man, I was fishing for tuna and I got something else. Or maybe nothing bit. We've all, probably all experienced this. Anybody that's gotten an email that says a Nigerian prince has $20 million and you can have a percentage of it if you'll only send them your banking information, has experienced this. And obviously, they're pretty easy to spot. Most general wide-scale phishing campaigns are pretty easy to spot. And they send them out to millions and millions of people every day. That's really not the most successful. Spear phishing, on the other hand, is by and large the most successful method of hacking into an environment. I read a study recently that was talking about spear phishing, and it stated that 40% of spear phishing campaigns are successful. Think about that for a minute. Almost half of the time somebody targets somebody with a spear phishing campaign, they can make their way into your network. That's scary. It's scary how easy this is as well. Spear phishing is looking at a particular target, right? Whether you're swimming under the water and seeing that tuna and taking your spear gun and shooting right at that tuna, you know what you're looking for. You're after a particular target, and you can shoot directly at that target. You ignore the other million fish because I want that particular one. Same concept in the IT world of spear phishing. Let's look at an example of how easy this is to do and how difficult it is to, in some cases, even prevent. So let's take a look at this email. Now, maybe this came from your wife. This email, Carrie Anderson sent it. James, hey, this popped up on my Facebook memories page for today. Thought you'd love it. And it looks like a picture of my daughter. And sure enough, I click it, open it, I'm like, oh, that's so cute. My daughter, wonderful. What you don't know is that was actually a spear phishing campaign. And you think, okay, hold on a minute. They knew my wife's name. They've got a picture of my daughter, right? And unbeknownst to me, as soon as I opened up that picture, it executed code on my laptop, right? So that was actually something called StegExploit. And no, this didn't really happen. But it's very easy to make it happen. StegExploit is actually hiding code inside the pixels of an image, right? It's based on steganography, which was a method of sending encrypted messages back and forth. Spies used to use it back in the day, where they would actually encrypt words in the image and just send images back and forth, right? And we can use this to execute code because tools like even HTML5's canvas element, if you look at something called dynamic scriptable rendering of images, what that means is, as I'm rendering this image, as the browser, as the tool, whatever's running HTML5 is rendering this image, if it finds code in there, it will actually execute that code as well. And so, of course, you know what happens. The moment we can execute code on a box, on our system, whether it's a server or a laptop or what have you connected to the network, our house is on fire because we let them in the door. And that big bad wall that we thought we had up does us no good. Right? This is surprisingly easy to do. Now let's take a look at what it would take. Right? If we were actually going to execute this particular attack, because like I said, I don't know about you, but I'd probably fall for that. I'm in the IT world and in cybersecurity, and if I got an email from my wife that looked like it was very legit and had a picture of my daughter in it, I'd probably click on it. I'll admit it. Let's look at how easy it is to do. First thing you got to do is identify your target. Well, if you're going after a particular organization, right, you have to identify, well, who do I really want to target? Right? It's part of spearfishing. It's not just throwing out a wide net, but who do I want to actually target? Network admins, great person to target. You heard earlier, if you can get the credentials of one of your network administrators, you can just troll through their network at will, right? So network admins is a big target. Maybe one of the C-suite executives is a big target. And you know, there's a website out there that can help you identify all your targets. And I think most of you may even be using it. I know I use it. It's called LinkedIn. It's pretty easy for me to take a look at a company and go, you know what, I'd like to hack into that company, and open up LinkedIn, find dozens and dozens, if not hundreds of employees that have posted their entire resume out there in that company. Go, okay, wait, are there any network, oh, there's a network admin right there. At least he claims he's a network admin. I'm going to go after him, right? And you know what, if I find 2 or 3 of them, maybe 4 of them, I got a pretty good odds, if 40% of these things work, pretty good odds that I can pick all 4 of them, create a targeted spearfishing campaign for those 4 people, and probably half of them are going to click on it. Well, the next thing we have to do is do a little research. We have to identify the family, right? We want to identify email addresses. We want to download family photos. Great, go to Facebook, go to Instagram. If you've locked some of those out, go to a lot of the publicly available websites that are out there for looking through and searching through marriage records, for example, birth certificates. All this stuff is publicly available. So I can very easily find children's names, family names. Maybe we can't track down the wife, but we can track down the brother, right? Or maybe they've got a child that's in college somewhere and we can send it from them. The goal is identify something that is going to look legitimate for this email to come from. And then once you have a photo, which you can get from any number of places, you can encode it. Go to stegexploit.info. Whatever payload you want to deploy, keylogger or backdoor, what have you, you can encode it and it takes about 10 minutes and it's free. Well, the next thing you have to do is send a spoofed email. You got to make it look like it comes from an email address that you already know. You already know what their wife's name is. You already know what their husband's name is, right? It's pretty easy to go to something like spoofbox.com. There's probably 100 more just like it, and spoof an email. Now, if you've got in your network, if you've got a sophisticated email filter, there are ways of detecting spoofed emails. There are ways of saying, look, this says it came from this particular Gmail account, but it really didn't. It looks like it came from this other place. But because of VPNs, because of email forwarders, because of spam blockers and all kinds of other tools that typically try to stop some of this, intercept some of these messages and send them on, a lot of those aren't that effective anymore because they wound up blocking a lot of legitimate emails. But let's assume that you do have something that works in your organization and spoofing the email is not good enough. Well, that's fine. For $80 on any one of 10 dark websites, you can hack a Gmail account, right? Again, remember we talked about organized crime selling services? Well, there's a service right there. It costs $80 to hack Gmail. It's not hard to do. Send them $80 in Bitcoin, and within 24 hours, you get the password to a Gmail account. And then you can then log into that spouse's Gmail account and actually send it from her Gmail account. That way, if the target actually receives it and sends back a message saying, oh, that was really cute, you know, what are we doing for dinner tonight? You know, it won't tip them off because you can get the email, you can get the reply, and either delete it so that the spouse never sees it, or engage in a conversation as needed. This is not hard to do. This is the most successful method overall of hacking into an environment. This is the most successful attack vector. So they're in the door. Now that they're in, what happens? Right? What happens once they get their foothold on it? Because odds are the laptop that they just compromised is not what they're after. Right? That gets them past the outer wall. What happens? Well, the first thing that they're going to do, and this is generally within the first 24 hours, they want to secure their access. Okay? If they're detected on this particular system and kicked off, they want to find a way back in. They want to be able to get back in. So what are they doing? They're maybe installing code to open up a back door, installing keyloggers so that they can get passwords, user IDs to be able to traverse laterally in the network. In a lot of cases, they hop to a nearby node and install their backdoor on the nearby node. Because if somebody detects that, hold on a minute, let's say you go home and realize that your wife really didn't send that email, well, your guard's going to be up. You may talk to your IT department, and they may pull your system off the network right away. So generally speaking, in the first 24 hours, they're trying to secure their access. They're trying to make sure that they didn't make their way in the door and then immediately get kicked out, and now they got to go find some other easy mark to deal with. Over the next 150 days on average, and on average, that is how long a hacker is trolling through a network trying to find their marketable data, trying to find what they're looking for. On average, they spend 150 days. And what are they doing? Well, the easy method you heard earlier. Easy method is, okay, I secured a email and a ID and password, and then I can go log on to any box that I want. It's hard to protect against that without really locking down all of your domains, which we talked about earlier. A bit harder method, but maybe a bit more common method, is to go through the same process that we went through when we were trying to hack in from the internet. Right? We're trying to hack in from the internet. We're running discovery on the network. Right? Now, they're not going to blast out one big giant discovery, one big giant in-map scan across your whole network, because anybody with a small amount of SOC technical expertise is going to detect those things happening in their network. So usually they're going to do it in a much more sneaky way. But generally, they're sniffing traffic with Wireshark. They're looking at port scans for different environments. They're trying to map out the network so that they can figure out what it is that they're going after. In some cases, if it's an individual, they don't know. They're just trying to see what they can find, right? If they are targeting something, they're targeting a database, they're targeting a point-of-sale system, they're targeting things, they're trying to find them. And generally speaking, you're looking at about 150 days from when they're running discovery and they're looking at vulnerabilities, the same thing we talked about before. Great, I found this database, right? I ran a scan and I see that there's a SQL Server database or there's a DB2 database, and I really want to know what's in that database, right? Well, of course, I got to look at the version of that database. I got to see, are there vulnerabilities for that database that I could then exploit as well, that I could then use. Same situation, right? I'm looking at toolkits. I'm looking at rootkits. I'm looking at things like ExploitDB and Metasploit to figure out, is there anything that I can just download and use to get into this environment, or do I got to figure it out on my own? If I have to figure it out on my own, build and test something on my own, that is very dangerous to try to do inside somebody else's network, right? It's much easier just to download some kind of public exploit and try to execute it and see if it works. But on average, we're looking at 150 days that they're just trolling through the network. Once they find what they're looking for, we got 1 to 2 days on average between we found it and we ran the exploit to break into that database. Within 1 to 2 days, they're out the door and gone. So 1 day up here, 150 days, 1 to 2 days, right? Obviously in here is where we need to slow them down even more and try to prevent them from being able to traverse the network, because once they find what they're looking for, again, they run an exploit, they get into their database, they get into the file system, they get into whatever it is that they're looking for, and then they exfiltrate the data. Now, hackers are obviously intelligent people, and they know that we're running scans on the network trying to detect large data volume moves, trying to detect things that are outside of the norm for this network. We even have artificial intelligence systems now that learn what the normal network pattern and traffic looks like, so when something odd happens, right, we can detect it. So what are they doing? Well, they're not just taking data out in giant chunks and sending it out to some cloud service that, that doesn't belong to this company. They're breaking it up into little small chunks. In some cases, they'll use something like Wireshark to inspect the network traffic of that particular database and say, what does normal look like? How much data flows in and out of this system on a regular basis? Maybe every Sunday at 2 o'clock, there's a backup of the data that happens. Well, that's normal. Then I'm going to go in Sunday at 2 o'clock and I'm going to extract the whole database, right, while that backup is happening, because our network tools know that that's pretty normal. Or they're going to split it up into a bunch of chunks of data and move those chunks of data to different systems they've already compromised, move them off-site, and put them all back together. And then once they exfiltrate the data, then we're into cleanup mode, right? Cleanup mode is about not getting caught. They're going to clean the access logs so that we can't trace them from their hops back to the original source. Right? In some cases, especially for state-sponsored and even for some of the more advanced organized units, they'll implement false footprints. So instead of pointing to this group, they'll point to another group. Or instead of pointing to this country, if we followed the trail back, maybe it pointed to Russia. Well, okay, great. Russia says, I don't want that to happen. Instead, I'm going to point them at North Korea. We've seen that happening in the news quite often lately. Those are false footprints. But it doesn't take long to imprint false footprints. So you can tell out of these three kind of models and time frames, you've got the best chance of stopping them right here once they make it into your network, right? Keeping them out, obviously, is what happens. I mean, you're keeping out millions of attacks a day, a week, a month today with your firewalls, right? But again, if somebody really wants to make it in, they can either go up and sniff inside those ports and see what they can poke through. A good vulnerability management strategy will help with that. But with spear phishing, if they really want to make it in right now, there's a pretty good chance they can make it in. So we need to figure out a way during these 150 days to detect them and kick them off, which is kind of what the next section's about. Right? What can you do about it? Well, I'm going to talk about 4 different tactics, 4 different strategies for how you can make this better. Right? There's no easy one-size-fixes-all. The first one is very obvious to you, and you've probably been harped on it over and over and over and over and over again for your entire career, but we've got to get better at patching our known vulnerabilities. Not only on the outside world, around that hard shell, right? Generally, we do a pretty good job of patching things that are internet-facing. Pretty good job of strengthening that hard outer shell. We do a very poor job of what I call the soft, squishy center. Right? Everything that's inside your castle walls, generally speaking, companies aren't doing a very good job of patching that. And let's look at some statistics. Right? 43% of companies have had a data breach. I'm not wild about that statistic because I'm not going to change it, but I wish it said 43% of companies have reported a data breach. Right? There's a lot more that have had a data breach and chose not to report it. And there's even more that have had a data breach and they don't know. Right? It's not that they didn't report it, they just don't know. So if 43% have reported it, you can imagine how many have actually had a data breach. I suspect that's north of 70%. For that, 80% of those breaches were caused by known vulnerabilities. And by known vulnerabilities, I'm not talking about 0-day versus non-0-day. I'm talking about the organization scanned their environment and they knew that there was a vulnerability in that particular component and they didn't do anything about it. In fact, that's what the next bullet point talks about also. Almost 100%, 99.9% of them, right, have had a patch available for over a year. So we scanned, we knew there was a problem, there's a patch available, there's been one available for probably a year, and we still didn't fix it. And that comes back to the last bullet here, the last statement. On average, it takes companies 193 days to patch a vulnerability once it's known. That is a crazy number, right? Is a crazy number. Now that's across the board on your vulnerabilities. If you run a scan and you see you've got a CVSS score of 10, it's super critical, it's in the news, I'm not saying it's going to take you 193 days to fix it, right? But if we look across the board at your vulnerabilities, because remember, hackers aren't just looking at the 10s, they're looking at easy opportunities. If on average across the board, it's taking us almost 6 months to patch a vulnerability once we know about it. So we've got to get better at this. Let's look at an example. Well, first let's talk about 0 days, right? Examples next. This is an interesting quote from Gartner, right? Now, pay close attention to this because some of you guys may actually fall into that category. But I've given this talk a couple of times. And most of the time I'm talking with groups of companies that are not sensitive government targets. But through 2020, right, 0-day vulnerabilities will play a role in less than 0.01% of attacks in general, if you exclude those sensitive government targets. And if you don't know, I think most of us probably do, if you don't know, 0 day is basically just a previously unknown vulnerability. It exists in the product maybe for years before it becomes publicly available. So when we talk to Gartner, this is a quote from Gartner. I've got a couple more slides with Gartner data in it. When we talk with Gartner, they're saying, look, 0 days are not the, 0 days, you get a lot of the media attention, but 0 days aren't the problem, right? They're not the problem. And why aren't they the problem? Most 0 days are being hoarded by the governments. And you know how many of those are out there trying to actively hack, right? Again, just a guess, but maybe there's 10, 15 governments out there that are engaged in some sort of espionage against the United States. 10 to 15 versus a million individuals. Those million individuals aren't hoarding 0 days. Trust me, if they get a 0 day and they can get a $100,000 payday from a company that's offering bug bounties, they're handing them out. Governments, though, on the other hand, aren't. So what is the problem? According to Gartner, which does tons of research on this, the problem is that we don't have an ability to very rapidly determine which of these vulnerabilities are most likely to cause us harm. Right? Most likely to cause us harm, and then take action on it. And I'm going to use an example. That example's next. Let's use an example. WannaCry. Perfect example. All right? Everybody knows what WannaCry is. But what most of the people that I talk to don't quite realize, WannaCry that we know is actually WannaCry 2.0. WannaCry 1.0 happened in 2016. WannaCry 1.0 was a phishing attack. Now, it used the same encryption result, right? But you got an email, whether it was a spear phishing or a global phishing, which I think most of them are global phishing attacks. You got an email, and if you clicked on it, it went to a compromised website, which we talked about earlier, and downloaded the WannaCry payload, which then encrypted the hard drive. But it didn't jump from system to system to system like WannaCry 2.0 did, right? But it used the same, WannaCry 1.0, it used the same result. It was a ransomware that was a phishing campaign. It wasn't that successful. I'm sure some people clicked on it. Some people went to that website, and it downloaded that code and encrypted their hard drive, but it wasn't that successful. And then comes March, right? MS-1710, which is a CVE released from Microsoft that detailed the vulnerability. Now, at the time, right, that vulnerability was actually classified as an 8.5 for the CVSS score. In fact, I think it still is, but 8.5 is high, maybe critical, depending upon what kind of scale you're looking at. About a month later, we see Eternal Blue hit. Shadow Brokers released Eternal Blue, which was an exploit kit from our government, right? They were hoarding this 0 day, as all governments do, and then it got out. Shadow Brokers released it to the world, right? Within 3 days, 3 or 4 days, excuse me, that's actually 3 or 4 days right there, from the 14th to the 19th, we started seeing some collaboration on the dark web. Ideas floating around saying, hey, do you see what came out with Eternal Blue? Just think if we could marry that with something like WannaCry so that we could automatically spread this ransomware across a network. How cool would that be? Within a couple of days, right, between when the exploit came out and we started seeing chatter. And then a month later, WannaCry 2.0 hits. So that's the timeline. But here's the important part as far as I'm concerned with what we heard on the previous slide from Gartner. Right? That had an 8.5 on the criticality scale. During that same time frame, right, between March and May, we had 1,300 other CVEs released in March, right? 1,500 in April and 1,000 in May. Over 1,100 were at 8.5 or above. 1,100 CVEs released 8.5 and above, right? Most of the organizations that I talk to cannot handle that level of change, by far, right? In fact, they tell me I can handle about 10% of the vulnerabilities that we're getting, unless I add 10x the staff, which nobody's going to do, right? In fact, I even had one company tell me, look, without automation, I could hire 1,000 people trying to run patches for us, and I still wouldn't be able to keep up with the vulnerabilities. So here's the big question. This goes back to what Gartner said earlier. Here's the big question. If I've got this level coming out, how do I sort through the needle in the haystack? How do I figure out which of these vulnerabilities is most likely to cause harm? Because honestly, when all this happened, WannaCry is the only one that was causing mass chaos in the industry. How do I figure out which one was most likely to cause harm? And that's what this next tactic is all about. Threat-centric vulnerability strategy. Adopt it, learn it, figure out how it works. Okay, and here's a couple more quotes from Gartner right here. Right? First quote is, if you're going to adopt this type of methodology, you have to accept a couple of realities. You can't possibly fix everything. So stop trying. If you believe you can fix everything, you're delusional, right? And here's a good example. Last year, we had 15,000 vulnerabilities that were released last year. The year before that, we had 6,000 vulnerabilities. If you go back to the early 2000s, we were at 1,000 to 2,000 vulnerabilities per year, right? It's going exponential. The number of vulnerabilities that are being released is on an exponential curve. And if you believe you're going to be able to stay ahead of this and fix every single vulnerability that pops up, then you're missing the point, right? You can't really know how secure your assets are, and therefore you can't really know how secure your organization is. That's what a threat-centric vulnerability strategy is all about, is figuring out what is most likely to cause your harm. And I'm going to skip some of these statements because I think I only have 5 minutes left. But this really talks about, this data is also from Gartner, that talks about how only very few CVEs are actually used in a majority of the attacks that are out there. So let's look at an example of how this works. This is real data from a company that I worked with back in October, right? Because we were talking about this threat-centric approach. And so we said, first, let's scan the environment, right? There were 1,400 CVEs released in October of 2017. Well, obviously, you don't have to deal with all those CVEs because you only deal with the CVEs that are affecting your infrastructure. So when we married those two together, this is where most organizations stop. We run a scan tool, right? We compare it to our infrastructure, and then we have to deal with what's in the middle. And in this case, for this company, there was 370 sitting in the middle, right? That's about a fourth of the infrastructure was affected by a CVE. Well, then we need to take a look at public exploits. Because honestly, what's more damaging? A CVE that comes out with a CVSS score of 9, right, which is pretty high, or a CVE that's been around for maybe 3 or 4 months, has a score of 7, and has 5 public exploits available for it, right? On one side, they have to build their own exploit, which is going to take time, right? And we already know that for a majority of the hackers, they're going after easy targets, as opposed to downloading a piece of code and hitting execute, which anybody with a small, tiny little bit of technical expertise can execute. And when we compared these two, and when we merged them together, we really see that if we're looking at what is most damaging to our environment, it's what's sitting right in the middle between your CVEs, your infrastructure, and what public exploits are available for those two areas. And in this particular case, right, we wound up with dealing with 19 CVEs versus 1,435. Most organizations can handle this. Now, I am not saying that these are not important by any means, right? But what we're saying is, if you've accepted the fact that you're not going to get all of this, what should be first on your priority list, right? What should be first? And that's what the threat-centric approach is all about. Education, very important. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but as far as phishing campaigns go, run education over and over and over again. And then the last tactic, and I've got to run because we're going to run out of time here, is a honeypot. I don't know why more companies don't use them. Set up a honeypot. It's something that sits in your network, right? Sits in your data center. Nobody has any right to actually touch it. So if something starts scanning it, poking it, prodding it, trying to log in, you know there's somebody on your network. And the last slide that I have is about BMC. How can we help, right? We're on booth number 4. If you want to come talk a little bit more about some of these tactics or strategies, or you want some help in some of these areas, we've actually got 4 different solutions in the security space. BladeLogic helps with automating that patch management process. Discovery helps with finding what's out there, right? And we heard about this earlier. You can't fix what you don't know about. Blind spot analysis is absolutely critical to vulnerability management. And then we've got a response tool that helps align your security and operations teams together and automate that vulnerability management flow. And then policy, which is about cloud security. If you're in the cloud and you've never looked at what it takes to make those components secure, it's an eye-opener. And in fact, we've got a little 5-minute video that we can show you at any time that takes you from a blank instance to actually seeing how vulnerable your cloud components really are and then fixing them. So with that, I think I'm probably a minute over. I want to say thank you very much. I appreciate your time, and I hope you learned something out of this. That's all.